Hello everyone, today we talk about the reasons of the Umayyad Caliphate success. One of the most striking and exceptional pages in the history of Eurasia, right? As you know, under the Umayyads of Damascus, the Caliphate established itself for the first time in a firmly statal setting with an important administrative apparatus, a permanent military, and it fundamentally reached the greatest boundaries that a unitary caliphate ever owned, right? Even though, of course, the thing was much less unitary than we think at the time, but still this derived from the Syrian direction of Syrian control over this the ethnic Arab military communities that were gradually brought, and with great effort it lasted half a century, so practically one half of the entire Umayyad duration, at least excluding the Caliphate of Cordoba, and cutting therefore also with much of the previous Islamic tradition. As you know, the Umayyads emerged fundamentally as the supporters of the initially of the elective choice, not the lineage connection with Muhammad, and eventually dynasticized themselves in Damascus, the same caliphate as such, and under their rule, some of the most important, like the second fitna, for example, or the simple, in fact, continuation of the same Islamic conquest, and the largest ones occurred. And so some of the greatest events of early Islam. And there will be really a lot to talk about. The Umayyads recently didn't make lots of videos about Islamic history, just randomly. So in the first years we talked more about that, but it's crucial really to understand it, to understand also the intersection with the broader religious military view of Islam that actually owes dramatically, if not entirely, especially in the motivational idea of the Holy War, to the Persian Aryan ideology, right, the Indo-European one, and the prolonged relation between the Bedouin tribes of the Arab interland and this universal empires such as Rome and the Sassanids, and way before that, frankly, created a unique combination historically, without which, in fact, the same success of the early Islamic conquests cannot really be understood. I made a video about medieval Islam, and I already made multiple videos comparing essentially broadly speaking, the civilizational accomplishments of the caliphates, if you prefer this point, and the Latin Germanic world, especially the Carolingians. Very interesting things emerged, right? Not just because, of course, on the long run, the Western system took over, right? And took over in so many ways that are incredible, considering what are apparently initial shortcomings of the same. We may have underestimated properly the early medieval West, but also and especially for the astonishing enormity of the Islamic conquests. And not only, but also the process of Islamization and Arabization that fundamentally changed in a relatively few time the face of many countries that literally passed from, it had nothing to do with Arabia, but fundamentally they began to speak Arab, they adopted Islamic faith, albeit of course there were many things going on at the same time, and there were reactions to that, there were rebellions. The same Islamic unity wasn't, as you know, arguably since the very beginning there, because it's based on the aforementioned ideal of continuous, of permanent struggle and victory that was interpreted in different ways, right? By the Sunni, the Shia, the same Abbasid revolution, as it's called, that took over the Syrian Caliphate, and essentially Persified the in fact the Caliphate further culturally, and almost so under Al-Mamun even the Shia could become the Islamic Orthodoxy once again. It wouldn't happen, but it could, and we went pretty close to that. Is a proof, in fact, of course, the agitation under the Islamic surface of an enormous set of culture, of systems, of belief, of identities, etc., that should be studied much more thoroughly, and that make us reflect, especially regarding the enormity, again, of the early Islamic conquests, extensionally, pose us historically in front of the question is, why did that happen, right? There are stupid questions that we pose ourselves sometimes, like, why did Rome fall? Like, how is it normal even for an empire to last that long? You should ask yourself. Regarding the Islamic world, we tend to say, okay, well, on the long run, they eventually didn't make it in a way or another, right? After the golden age of Islam, by the 10th, 11th century, the system hopelessly fragmented. It kind of skeletonized. Also, urbanism didn't take off, unlike in the West. Why is that? And so we see on the longer run the West triumphing. But have you ever reflected about the beginnings of that? I made already videos addressing this, like, the reason of success of the early Islamic conquest. There are many reasons. I don't know how much I will be digressing on them today. It's obvious that you can read it from different side of the story. The Byzantine one, for example, is quite fascinating. See how effectively what we know as the Caliphate, especially the Umayyad one, was a Syro, Palestinian Egyptian system that was basically Roman in nature, right? And this is a great character of the Umayyad Empire. It was fundamentally a Roman empire. Roman Byzantine at that point. I mean, all these were the most powerful provinces. At least, they were very powerful provinces in the Byzantine East that, as you know, had for centuries and centuries long, and never found really peace. They had struggled continuously. This centrifugal push, creating enormous doctrinal issues, spreading heresies, making Constantinople compromise, and in turn compromising the relations with the Western Christendom, that in practice was already such, even though, of course, there was no schism at the time. There would be schism actually on that occasion. I think the Tricapitoline one, or all the issues with iconoclasm that at least happened later. In Umayyad times, the Caliphate's ships, crews that besieged Constantinople, in fact, under the Islamic command, were Christian, right? The naval engineering, the development, was all that. There was a great process of assimilation. The Muslims didn't actually destroy, for example, the Library of Alexander, for what they found there. Still, they treasured immediately. We know this from the Islamic early traditions up to Southeast Asia, right? They spread the name of Alexander. Alexander the Great was a way more important figure in medieval Islamic epos than in the Christian one, even though it was really central in the West as well. We know the Muslims had knowledge of classical works during the Middle Ages that we have lost in the West now, and that talk, for example, about explorations of the geysers of Iceland, dating from antiquity, and knowing, in fact, a world that, let's say, today is lost because also these countries have lost that knowledge in part due to radical turns and issues that have historically every country there went differently, let's say, but that there was a time in which, in fact, these people knew more than us in certain specific terms regarding our ancient past than we did, right, in medieval times. There was, it's difficult even to list properly all the legacy that was taken on by the Muslims in the Roman East. Naturally, in the West, we are very inclined to say, okay, no, there's a cut, right, starting from the Pyrrhans ideology. Now the Muslims arrive, everything is closed, the Mediterranean is closed, everything declines. There is nothing. This is today, historiographically, basically this is just a lie. There is not a single glimpse of evidence of this. That, on the contrary, during the Islamic Golden Age, great part of also what we see out is the same development of in the northern shores of the Mediterranean that managed eventually to push out the Islamic piracy that we think was Islamic, but very often it was Christian, right? How many so-called Saracens were actually Spanish, Italian, Greek Christians that were simply fighting, like piracy has always been, right, everywhere, like just in the Viking era, right? You think there weren't Christian Vikings, right? These are just the secularistic, modernistic, paranoid, categoristic, ethno-nationalistic delusions that just the deeply rooted cultural inferiority of modernity can come up with, right? It's a grave deficit in moral and scientific intelligence. It's the complete illiteracy of any universal standard understanding of what the sacred means, just for saying another aspect. So for us, it's, again, still the 19th century nationalistic, Victorian style idea of separation of countries, of peoples, of languages, or everything. It wasn't anything like that. And it was brutal too, right? But it also was, for that very reason, a moment of dramatic development and nurturing of also of powers that, in reaction to that, managed to take off incredibly. The way we read history today, again, is appallingly disgusting, right? Not just because of the materialistic, deterministic, and properly anti-traditional view of reality, not the traditional view of reality that, people think today tradition is. That has nothing to do with tradition, right? Basically, virtually nobody knows today among the so-called traditionalists what tradition even means. We're talking about real tradition, the one we talk about also, teaching some religion and universal values. On this channel, gradually we will resume it soon at some point, but it's too much distant of a word for us to understand. This is true, right? I firmly believe that, I see it, having studied the Middle Ages for decades at this point, that the West had already something that we have dramatically underestimated, right? Also in early medieval times. We will get to it at the end of the video, right? And we also have, let's say, an over-reliance on, however, our same patterns of historiography. Not much that is a bad thing, because in fact, in the West, was really still another mindset, right? Even in the Romano-Germanic world that is often put aside, every once in a while still get this dumb bullshit, like, the story, the Byzantines were Romans, which is becoming it's not becoming a historical point, it's becoming a nominalistic heresy, right? Because at some point we have decided that, in the West we were barbarians, and that just, Constantinople was who knows what, or that also the same caliphs really were. But in the way we approach history, we don't seem to make even the effort anymore in popular culture, not that we ever managed to do it at that level, but in trying to properly make history. It is reconstructing what occurred, and very often historiography is faulting that, because first of all, of the sheer lack of material, right? But also, and especially because of cultural differences, right? It is much of what we we try to revive about for example, even the Byzantine legacy or things like this, is that it's not looking at the sources and looking at what that word really was and understanding why sources were that way, and also just as any person who has a minimal medieval education realizing that sources were the way they were also because there was a deep difference, probably mentally, in the worlds that we have just to equate or bring at the same level of others, just to pretend that this hypocritical, terribly hypocritical attitude of, no, we are all, we leave benefit for the doubt to everyone. History is not made for leaving benefit of doubt, and history is made for the exact opposite, is to value and to judge cultural values. And that's the only reason why we study history, arguably, right? This at least entails, depending on what you mean with culture, it can entail everything, right? So, of course, history is everything. And it seems to be reduced, again, to nominalistic heresies, little words and phrases that not even make sense anymore. With Islamic world is even more complicated. First of all, language doesn't help. Say, I don't know, I can't translate Arab. I can't have if I impose, like if I search an Arab etymology, I can dig for it. I want to properly feel what kind of mindset that was, because in front of such a clamorous idea like the caliphate, you can't avoid doing that, right? But that's, again, what we have properly been eradicated by Marxism, not just eliminating any kind of cultural value in order to achieve the annihilation of humanity. So, of course, nobody really cares, right? If you ask a person to study religion, they think that you are, a church nuts and that, you have some problem. Whereas, not studying history of religion, not knowing anything about that, it's probably one of the most open forms of cultural underdevelopment of a civilization that I think, but severe lack of schooling, not just, you missed it at some point along the way. It's just mean that you come from a cultural background that doesn't exist, right? And this is the norm today. Basically, every person today, on average, doesn't even come close to even the remote interest or curiosity or awareness in these things. It doesn't help if you think about the Islamic iconoclasm that made the same Islamic world taking a certain shape, even just in the mental representations. It's more difficult for a Western mind to understand certain things. Also because the same Muslims carried out a Christian iconoclasm at some point. The same Umayyads did. Whereas it's interesting to see, of course, where, how everywhere in Islam at some point creatures were represented. And how, and that's and why in that context. It's quite fascinating. But one has to answer the enormous question: how was it possible they made it? Right? Not just they made it, again, in the first wave, because we can all understand that systems in crisis are easy prey of marauders. Let's be honest, the Arabs were just a bunch of Bedouins from the desert. They were nothing else, right? We're not talking about the rich, developed places in southwestern Arabian Peninsula. These were just caravan raiders, right? They knew the rest of the world. Again, if you look at the Ghassanids, the Lakhmids, who had to take over, and the rise of the Umayyads that had the powerful Qurayshites backing them, and this caused concern naturally from especially the primogenial Islamic perspective, that was a boundless holy war without any limit, right? This thing was condensed, in fact, eventually much more in the Shia Islam, that also by shifting towards more properly Persia, historically, and also in contrast, of course, with Damascus in those years, because the Umayyads had to reconquer all the Arab military colonies in Kufa, in Basra, etc. So where they had settled in today's Iraq fundamentally, whereas the Syrian side was something else, right? It was influenced by different models. You already spot the differences. The Umayyads took a very courageous decision, also a very debatable one, from the Orthodox standpoint, which is interesting because again, the Sunni Caliphate would become the orthodoxy, right? But here we're talking about a civilizational orthodoxy, the one of stable power, of states, of a power who is able to maintain itself and to retain control systematically, right? And to also gain consensus in the process, right? The initial decisions also to dynasticize the Umayyad was simply bought, or there was one against threat, right? So the Umayyads understood where civilization laid, and they set their bases there, right? So it's fair to say that the Muslim Empire of Damascus surpassed the exquisitely military structure of the domination that had already merged, right, with the elective caliphs. Again, there was really no alternative if you wanted to rule the world in that sense, right? Ali said, screw that, right? We want every Muslim to be in permanent struggle and victory and take over the entire world, like all together in our entirety, not with hierarchies, not with centers. Now, the monopoly of political power at the center and at the periphery remained, of course, in the hands of the more conspicuous families coming from Arabia. As we will see, this will play a great role in the also process of Arabization. These people had settled sparsely, right? So creating some centers of powers, as the Umayyads did with Syria, right? And this was quite advantageous for them. They chose it, right? Syria was Roman, right? Was a land of ancient urbanization, civilization. It was at the center of the transcontinental trade routes. It was on the sea. It was well connected also to rich areas all around. Initially, it was difficult, right? The caliphate, the Umayyads had properly to pay tribute to the Roman Empire, to Constantine IV. The main threat came, however, from the same Muslims, as we've seen, especially the one occupying Mesopotamia. But it was a model that was implicit in a certain sense, again, in that mindset, because the Ghassanids that had been under the Romans were by far the more disciplined Arabs, right? The Lakhmids had both in the east, in the Persian Gulf, a bit that kind of feudal sense, let's say, of privatistic idea of power that from the Sassanians, so we're something else, right? And it would live on in some ways in those areas. The backbone of the military forces involved in the domination, committed for the domination, remained under the Umayyads mostly Arab, but the way it was organized changed importantly, especially at the beginning of the 8th century. The army was beginning to be levied and paid through taxes, right? It included, of course, other elements. The important was the elite, right? In many areas, especially the ones that were more peripheral in the empire, we will see that, of course, the local ethnos surpassed the Arab one. And we speak of Arabicized elites. This is especially evident in North Africa, in Spain, of course. The old tribal distinctions among the Arab military communities, let's call it in this way, remained under the Umayyads. It was important just to have, as we'll see now, this sense of commitment of that wouldn't have to be distracted, because by government, by other aspect, of course it would happen on the longer run, but originally this was the cause of the Umayyad success. We will see that the Arab element remained connected to the military fort, right, whereas administration was essentially still in the hands of the local aristocracies, and especially there was no church like in the West. You will see now how the thing was done, actually. And the language used in all the government apparatus, so it's an incredible substitution of Greek and of Persian, of the Egyptian Coptic, of the Maghreb Latin, right? Because northern and Atlantic Africa spoke kind of a Latinized language at that point, and also the one of the Iberian Peninsula, of course, became Arab. Right, this is crucial. The government apparatus was Arabicized as well. Right, there was a strong imposition and brought properly by the conquerors that managed to Arabicize the administration. This was done also by co-opting the elements, but it could have not been possible without that military elite at the top that still managed the entire system, right? However, of course, the mechanisms of Arab domination absorbed gradually the previous administrative apparatuses in great hierarchical organisms according to criteria that were in fact drawn from the experience of the defeated empires, and especially from the sumptuous model of the Constantinopolitan court, right? It was a radical influence at that point. While it is true that the same Constantinopolitan court ritual and traditions, etc., famously were, heavily Persianized, right? Especially during the 7th century, for obvious reasons. The main Islamic model was the Roman one, and it's implicit in what we were saying before about the choice the Umayyads had made. It's not just proximity, it's properly an idea of power that is different from the Persian one that would be instead more reaffirmed by the Abbasids that stemmed from the Iranian plateau, right, from which also in later times still the Persia kept sending inputs to the court of Baghdad. And the model was obvious. For example, Damascus Chancellor was evidently modeled from the one of Constantinople. Also, this is evident in the bureaucratic praxis of the various governorates, using the pre-existing elements, right, and to what they were already habituated, right? Yes, the Umayyads, as we will see, arrived up to up to Central Asia, up to the Atlantic, but still, great part of their power was based again on the previous Roman provinces or Romanized provinces they had been, right, without a direct control. By the way, even I don't know about North Africa, where understanding of Byzantine presence there is relatively vague. There were also some Berber polities that were successor states to the Roman Empire that we also don't quite credit particularly, but Rome was Rome, right? It was not an option, was not something you could choose on, right? The only possible model for everybody, for the Arabs, for the Germans, Rome was Rome, right? And it was such a powerful idea that it managed to make their same Holy Roman Germanic Empire, the title of Roman ethnically. The Ottomans were Roman emperors as well, right? So we're talking about a legacy that was understood in sacral terms by such a magnitudinal scale, and radically impacting and fashion in the very depths of human civilization at the time, that we can't, with a secular modern mind, we can't basically understand anymore. The Arabs, again, took an enormous chunk of this, quite literally, materially, right? The elites, the military administration, the bureaucracy, the knowledge, the libraries, damn it, they were full of libraries. So this brought unavoidably the Umayyad Empire to structure in an ever more stable direction. The same army, the indigenous element, as we were saying, gradually entered with ever more intensity, converted to Islam. And this is a major attraction for fueling further the conquest, because if you are within the military elite, not just you take command, you're part of the system, but you are able to take over more territories. You are part of a community that is functionalized to systematic conquest, right? And this naturally has a graduality in turn as well, because if you pick again the conquerors of the Iberian Peninsula, the Berbers were more numerous than the Arabs, right? They came all from North Africa. And about this, also consider again the aptitude of the peoples that were subdued by the Arabs, because not only if you need some technical expertise or probably some instruments, such as a fleet, right, knowing how to operate, you need some personnel that already does it in a very advanced fashion. If you need properly the filing rank soldiers that are habituated to just fight like hell, because that's what they do as a living normally, you can draw from, I don't know, the Bedouins of North Africa, or the same Arabia. Arabia remains exactly the same. It doesn't change. Basically, the Islamic Empire is created on the base of other regional powers, right? And by which it's substantiated, right? But the military element keeps pouring in. This would be from the external, and this would be in fact a major feature, as you know, of Islamic armies during the Middle Ages, even beyond. The idea of the Ghulam or the Mamluk, right? So slave soldiers, serf soldiers that are drawn from conditions and backgrounds that where these people have nothing to lose, right? And so by fighting, they will eventually and hopefully be rewarded with land. They will eventually gentrify, become part of the local establishment, but also succumb in that sense, because they would soften up. And so this continuous political instability of Islam, after all, in terms of because there is not really a secular goal, and as we all seen, this is the double-edged sword of the thing. This military expansion is fueled by the military religious creed that had, it's the same one that had made any conqueror at the time triumphing at some point. It was the same ideology that Alexander used, that the Romans used, right? The Romans topping it, right? And the Arabs also having some trace of Chthonic telluric element, but still being enormously influenced again by the celestial religion of the Indo-Europeans. And this meant the possibility of always having an elite in arms, right, that could affirm itself more easily in this local context as a sort of permanent military occupation for the great endeavor of converting or expanding the Dar al-Islam on an ecumenic scale, which we would already think they had achieved, because they saw they had achieved, it already. I mean, it was such a huge empire that said this thing works, and this is what had also brought to the conversion from paganism. There wasn't really something that distant from the same mindset. I mean, that's yet another thing that is gotten improperly, right? There is no boundary really between monotheism and paganism in cultural terms, right? It's an invention, a formalistic invention of the same monotheism by a certain degree, but that doesn't, it's an approximation. The same monotheism works basically in the same exact way paganism really did, right? And especially these ones who were the only ones that could rise because they were celestial religions, right? Not Chthonic Telluric ones. So that's the real divide, right? And so the masses that were not militarized and were habituated to more civil lifestyle would just let this regime going on, because after all was notoriously less oppressive, right? The areas of Syria, Palestine, Egypt had a much lower fiscal pressure than in Byzantine times. The problem, does, as we will see, would come from also the permanent militarization, or the proclivity, the aptitude to taking up arms in this system. Again, it was an establishment founded on military colonies, so everybody thought what their share could be. So the, let's say, political administrative success of the Arab Empire seems all the more surprising when you pose in comparison the Latin Germanic kingdoms of the early medieval times and the same Carolingian Empire that was coexisting, might not at its peak, mainly with the Abbasids later on, but still, with an important degree of continuity. Because in the Latin Germanic world, the statal apparatus had always a very uncertain life, right? Especially north of the Alps, because of the absence of a bureaucratic consciousness properly among the hierarchy of the king's trustees, clientels, right? It was an entirely private system. It worked in a completely different way. The Umayyads create a state, right? The only states in Europe at the time were the Byzantine Empire and the Caliphate of Cordoba, right? There were some areas of Mediterranean, yes, they had something more bureaucratic, but they were not major powers, they were not regional powers, right? The Latin Germanic mechanism went through another system that, however, again, seems to have been dramatically more resilient. One has to explain why, fundamentally. Let's say that in the Latin Germanic West, the best organizational forces that were permeated of an adequate culture were absorbed in the ecclesiastical body, right? While in the Islamic world, that did not have a priestly hierarchy and was provided only for the service of the mosques of functionaries chosen by the community of the faithful or by the public authority, the entire organizational commitment overlapped with the political construction. It was supported by a religious faith that not represent, like in the Gaul of the Franks or in the Italy of the Longobards, an accomplished victory of the religion of the defeated over the one of the conquerors. Rather, the unitary awareness of the dominating people. It was proud of its own intransigent monotheism, and by the guarantee granted by God's omnipotence to his armed prophet and to the successors and the faithful of the prophet through the triumphal expansion in Arabia and from Arabia in the world. This difference, in my opinion, is radical and explains the magnitude of Islamic conquests originally, but at the same time the impossibility of keeping them together even on the medium ran. Because from one side you have this complete, this perfectly uncomplicated task. You simply have to take over the world, right? There is no other further concern. Great part of this came surely from different standpoints. I mean, if you pick the territories of the Roman Empire, including the one taken over by the Germans or taken over by the Arabs, you see that the populations were more or less okay with that, right? They paradoxically was the more underdeveloped areas that revolted, right? Like the Berbers revolted in North Africa, for example. In the Middle East, you have the local elites still backing, nurturing civil strife, but by supporting that, Arab tribe versus that other Arab tribe, right, and providing support. This is essentially also what happened in the West among the Germans, in a way, right? The struggle, I don't know, between the Franks and the Visigoths, or between also the Longobards and the Byzantines, right? So that's where I make videos trying, even uselessly, to make people understand that yes, there is such a thing like at some point a Byzantine reality, because everybody knows there were Romans, but if even the Italians prefer to back the Longobards against Constantinople, that objectively was kind of a Greek Eastern thing at that point, and not a Latin Germanic one. Well, there is a reason, right? And it's not a matter of personal opinion. In part, however, to coming back to the comparison between the Germans and the Arabs, you see that the Germans also came from, paradoxically, even maybe in some cases from better, slightly more advanced backgrounds than one of the Arabs in the migration era, but still they lacked a uniform driving ideology. That is to say, monotheism was fundamentally alien to them. They also, of course, had, again, a single idea of the god of war and of the sky that was superior to everybody else. But they would still, their action limited to areas that, first of all, they had issues in managing effectively, because the closer they were to the borders, the least advanced they were, the further inland they would go, they would meet the empire itself. And so they actually managed to score success when they managed to settle in this or that, essentially Gaul, Spain, Italy, much lesser part also in Britain, considering the accomplishment. But still, in areas where, again, they were meeting, realities were in part exhausted, yes, like the ones the Arabs took over, but they found an ideology there that was essentially controlled already by the establishment and couldn't be stripped away, right? The Germans had this issue. They tried to maintain the Aryan thing, was a compromise that was nor, black nor white, had to decide, and they all ended up being assimilated as Catholics at the end of the day, and that's on the only moment where things started working well in the system. The Muslims didn't have this problem because they didn't care, right? The dhimmis paid a tax that, again, was less than what normally as subjects they would have paid under the Byzantines. If you wanted to join the establishment, you had to convert, and you would be fully devoted to the systematization of that power. And there was no other force that was stopping or checking you, right? This, again, could push the expansion to the utmost boundary, but it lacked an internal control. The church in the West, especially in Western Europe, because in Constantinople the emperor ruled the church. In the West, this was not present there. The church had its boundary, had its non-earthly dimension. And as such, this authority had to be respected in a way that always entailed a negotiation. The idea that power had to be carefully planned out, had to be essentially measured on the full spectrum of the community. That your action could not be unlimited, couldn't bring your power to just take over the world for the sake of it from a day to another, because it was just a struggle. You had to stop down and build something and settle something gradually, even if resources were taken away from the expansion, but sedimenting a more stable ground. That is the one for which by the 11th century, the 12th century, the West basically has already surpassed in propulsive capacity the East, and was able to maintain control of that. Right? Think about the Mongols as well. The Mongols would take over the world, most of Eurasia, practically. How much did their empire last? The same goes for the Arabs. In the moment they reach the Atlantic, the Talas River, they fragment. They would never re-achieve that anymore. They had something like that as well, because of course the same factions of Islam paradoxically brought to a greater stability there, because there was an internal competition within the same Islamic splits that brought to that negotiation, for which, the other side idea could permeate your own. You had to check them and to be careful, and so you had to create the premises for internal orthodoxy that would work, etc. But this was based also on a disconfession of the other, right? Whereas in the West, while kings fought against each other, they didn't fight against each other because they were more or less Christian than each other. Even when, say, they were excommunicated, they were because they had failed the common religion as individuals, not because their people or their establishment was, interpreting Christianity in a different way. So this allowed Christianity in a universal, Western Christendom in a universal sense, to put the premises of its own power within themselves, so that they wouldn't have that. This conferred a dramatic self-confidence to the system, right? The Islamic world was rigged by this constant prejudice instead that existed towards lay authority, because somebody could easily have betrayed Islam just because it was unsuccessful, right? Why this constant need also for military expansion to prove in arms control, right? This was in order to test whether God supported you or not. If it didn't, it was a problem. It could be overthrown. Whereas in the Judeo-Christian tradition, the attitude towards regality was dramatically different. It was accepted, right? The Jews brought in Western culture this respect for constituted authority, right? It was dramatically important since Roman times. The Western Christendom injected this element of lordly superiority that is embodied also by the same feudalism, by the revival of medieval civilization, by the idea that the imperium had to be pursued, right? And that, however, you had to be quite careful in that sense on the, the choices that you made, because the imperium could be contested not just in arms, could be contested from within your own home, right? Which is, again, in part what in the sense would occur to Islam, but in the Western case, it wouldn't cause the fragmentation of the universal system. In Islam, it did. In Islam, everything broke down. Were many different Islams, let's say, each thinking they are the right one, right? Which is still very different from what happened within the Christian shell that, after all, by the wars of religions in the modern age, etc., still is within that, under that cap, right? Naturally, also in Islam, there are attitudes that tend to stress the comprehensivity, but there is not today any movement fundamentally that recognizes this in concrete terms, right? It's easy to say, okay, we're all Christians, we're all Islamic. It's not that simple. But again, the distrust existing in Islam, that still calls for further struggle and to fuel it and to prove it and to test it. So that's also why jihadism has a place in this world, and Christendom doesn't have it. It's true today that Christendom factually doesn't exist anymore. It's true that also Islam today doesn't quite exist anymore, in the sense that, how many Muslims do actually know Islam, right? It's the same problem that exists in the West, basically. But this is valid for any religion, right? Nobody really knows anything about their own religion. Let's be honest about that. Nobody studies that, right? Everybody interprets it like, a third grader would do, and pretending that, okay, I'm part of the team. I feel special because of that. No, just an idiot, right? And even when you are within it, you're supposed to make an effort, right? That's to understand it further, to live up to those standards. If you don't even know those standards, you can be baptized, you can be part of whatever you see it, like of Islam, the Dar Islam, but how do you feel that? How do you substantiate that, right? If you don't struggle and win. This is the only universal reality of religion. Struggling and winning. Where is this? Right? It's been forgotten in part. Now, things are complicated, of course, by other factors that are broadly cultural, political, social, etc. But it's evident that the shape, these phenomena took are very different. Right? The Roman Empire took a long time to expand, right? Compared to the Caliphate, but also lasted for a freaking long time. And already there, arguably, this happened because it was a partial internal check and balancement deriving from the Chthonic substratum that, if you want, the church took the place of also in the pagan world, right? The Rome was, probably the most radically, self-confident idea of the celestial glory, but it also was quite firmly rooted on the necessity of winning over, of Romanizing, of having this capacity of properly elevating the world itself through itself, because they knew there was a substratum that was not part of the same thing, and it had to be elevated in that regard. I don't think Islam did this, right? The thing eventually was inherited by Christianity after Rome, etc. In Islam, I don't see that. In Islam, I think that this monopoly of the establishment in a militaristic sense, and the absence of a check and balancement from a religious point of view, aside from the further fragmentation of Islam, but it couldn't be otherwise, right? Because you can't have just an unchecked expansion and then keeping things together. It doesn't work. No empire historically ever achieved that. Didn't care, in fact, whether non-Muslims actually lived within their own territory. For the Christians, instead, was a big deal. So you can see part of that evangelical mission that the Romans had, living in the Christianization of Europe as well, because it meant to be part of the big universal system. Islam says to convert also forcibly, but in practice, this was not achieved. In part, it might have done, especially in the first hour, such as the one of the Umayyads, because there was so much else to conquer, because they understood in practical terms that there were lots of other lands open. Because once you take away basically half of the Roman Empire and you make the also the Sasanian one, which is a hell of a system, collapsing, where it stretches from literally the Black Sea to the Persian Gulf to the Red Sea to Central Asia. I mean, you really make, and around there is really not much else, right? The Arabs try to invade Islam and eventually India, and they are checked there eventually, but they just unhinged the system, because the struggle between those empires had some Roman and Persia had somewhat catalyzed also all the other energies around. In the north you have the steppes, in the south you have either the sea or Black Africa. It's not that You can't really centralize in those areas. So the discontent caused by the Byzantine bureaucratic fiscal oppression that is witnessed in the West as well, and makes many regions bailing out, or even within the Byzantine Empire, to distance radically from Constantinople from a cultural point of view. So Romance my eyes, is the proof of this, right? And consider that what the Umayyad, the Arabs in general, take over at this point are areas that were historically under millennial empires for millennia, right? That were habituated to pharaohs, kings of kings, etc. And whereas whenever they meet also with a tribe, things start becoming more complicated, right? Islam has an important spreading capacity from a cultural point of view, goes beyond, because as all monotheisms has this, attractive capacity for the elites to kind of to establish a more structural hierarchy in order based on this more complex, sophisticated theology. But it also spreads over areas that were somewhat exhausted and already kind of habituated to be ruled in a part, and accepted again the role that they had under Islam. Again, the Palestine, Egypt, Syria opened their gates to the Muslims. Somewhere, not quite literally, there were plenty of people living there that opposed strenuously the Islamic conquest, but at large, right, nobody can explain again the speed of those conquests that happened, of course, with military victories, and pretty astonishing ones, also against the Byzantine army that was, yes, exhausted, but up to a certain point still was the largest power out there, and they were also very effective tactically, even when they were most of the Arab sources at the time naturally say, the Romans were too many, right? Actually, they were very often the same size, if not less even, but one of the Arabs. But let's say you can't rule over a region if you don't have the decisive moral support of the population, and that's fundamentally what we get. And again, it's quite interesting, also in the way this eventually in every country took a different form, and naturally, the more the local element was co-opted, see Spain especially, the more lasting the system was, right? Whereas wherever the establishment was instead kind of more unruly just per se, and knew how to retain control, of course, they would kind of, and also because they were naturally more distant lands in a sense, so it was also more complicated to rule them in a way. So again, this aspect, the Western world had a church that obliged the conquerors to confront themselves with the judgment of God, being always provoked and challenged in that sense, in ways that would need to gain the full cooperation of people that lived, if you want, differently from them, and that wanted to still retain part of the control, because the church would, right? And finally managing to create that unity that would occur, because you can't see these issues in the Latin West in the High Middle Ages. You see, you don't have a system, even compared to Constantinople. Constantinople becomes just Constantinople. The entire empire is exclusively Constantinople and nothing else. If Constantinople falls, it's over. This is what Machiavelli also wrote about, saying Constantinople in Ottoman times. It says yes, they are powerful, they're strong, they have a strong army, monarch, etc. But you crush that, take Constantinople, it's over. Try to invade France and see what happens. Once you take out a prince that has the army of a king, and then you take over another one. But everywhere in the country, everybody's against you. And you have to, how do you do it? So this arrangement, in a sense, between the establishment and the subjects, which is mutual, which is consensual, which for which Islam could have not happened as a historical phenomenon if this consensuality had not happened, provided this incredible capacity of speeding up the conquests, but in a sense without taking enough root, if not the same roots that existed on the main powers at the time, what did form as basis of power later on. You have the Abbasids that are fundamentally based on Mesopotamia, like the Sasanians were. You have then the Fatimids in Egypt, as Egypt had always been a seat of power of some sort. The same part goes for Syria, as we've seen. You see it, the Aghlabids in Tunisia, because Tunisia was already, advanced and Romanized, and you have Spain, because Spain has always been Spain. It had been the Romans, the Visigoths, and others even before, of course, ruling from the south. That's what I was exitating, because Count the Carthaginians were ruling from there too. So these are eventually the powers that rule, and there is no unity between them anymore, factually. Whereas Christendom, also in the domestic relations, has always kind of been extremely attentive to unite. Right, we've seen it also recently and randomly even with Orthodox powers that were assimilated formally by the same Roman Church at some point, because the goal, the objective, was factually only that one, possibly that one. Right, there was no other way to check through the church all the secular powers and to consider the West as a whole in the moment of its greatest expansion. Right, so again, this is extreme, because what the West expanded, consolidated like in the Middle Ages, it remained there as Western, hardcore forever. You can argue, well, also, the Arabs, Muslims, we're always seeing the Arabization, Islamization. Yes, but it's interconnection. This is an important aspect. Again, Islam also, in the modern age was more successful than Christendom from a strict religious point of view, because more people were won to Islam during the modern age in Asia, in Africa, than the Christians won others elsewhere, right? And also the Christians won a lot, by the way, but Islam was even more. So, but again, the unity wasn't quite there. And unironically, the greatest power that it didn't make it to hegemonize Islam, because it was always Safavid Persia, Mughal India, etc., was the Ottoman Empire, also because it was a dramatically more westernized empire that was born properly in the West, because the Bosphorus is the West since ever, and and its stability lasted for a longer time, as opposed to other areas. Naturally, there are other dynamics, right? Try to centralize India from ancient to modern times. Good luck with that. Just saying. If every domination that went there was swallowed eventually by the system. Also because it was a huge system, objectively. Again, it's not easy. So this is a set of pros and cons, right? And on the long run, you see the outcome of it. Right, so they both achieved something. We can argue that, yes, what about the Christendom today? The Christendom also went so fast, wide, that, it outperformed everybody to the point of softening up and even rejecting the sacred tradition, religion, earlier than the others. Islam, again, as we've seen, with all the imperfections due to the fact that, again, like in Christianity, find me, a Christian or a Muslim that are actually, aware of their religion, who actually know what they mean. That's another challenge, believe me. But Islam is more Islam, in fact, right? Because politics was always religion at the same time. That's yet another important aspect, right? It's as if the Westerners made eventually of their own moral superiority from an individual point of view in the aforementioned sense, because everything was compacted around those values, and they were not subjects that delegated to others. But this produced the loss of a sacred in a sense. And so our, let's say, the thing that cannot be given away is exactly this, our force of us. Islam never gave away the properly the religious nature of politics. Everything is God's, and you rule exclusively because of God. And you shouldn't usurp what's God's, right? You can't, emerge as a secular ruler. That's why the Malik, for example, as a king, is loaded in Arab, like with a negative semantics, because it said, who's this guy? It's just a king. It's not our caliph. It's not our sultan. It's not really somebody who was even just delegated on behalf of that university. It's just a king, right? Rex, in Latin, is overloaded of sacred power ever since archaic Rome, by a degree that over exceeds that. And of course, this in the Middle Ages, that was slightly different from the time of Rome, because in the time of Rome, the rex and the priests were one thing practically. The emperor was the top religious figure as well, not just as Pontifex Maximus, but properly in the nature of power. In the Middle Ages, there's this split. And it's a very interesting split because it does, again, slow down lots of things, but on the long run, it consolidates them by a degree that no other civilization did. And it does stem from the realization that while there is a celestial power that you have to be wary of, and reminding you that you are limited, and you have to be very watchful of God's wrath, it still tells you that you can and you must take responsibility always for everybody, right? Which is again, in an entirely Christian world, because everybody was Christianized, just the Jews were maintained as a minority, and by the way, just, thought to be given, that they would have just for going to hell in the end, but they had to be the witness of the second come of Christ, and that's the only way, the reason why they were tolerated, right? And in fact, you have the expulsion of Muslims. You don't really have an area in Europe where, it wasn't dominated by Muslims that eventually remained Muslim once the Christians took over, right? So think about that, because these are differences that were made at the time with models that could have literally changed in ways that we don't even just, the Shia-Sunni struggle is a pretty good example of that, but that is already in a very advanced time, right? The Mahdi and even the Sunni believe in the Mahdi, as you know, in the Messiah, and the fact that they just say that it's not born yet, like the Jews. Whereas the Shia, as you know, depending on their own various sects, let's say, also think that is already absconded after the series of the 7 of the 12, or there were even others, if I'm not wrong. And just think about that mindset. Just think about how much of a difference that can make. In any case, I will keep talking about Islamic history, because we have to catch up with a lot of stuff that we didn't say about it in the recent times. Just again, merely straight. Yeah, it's true. But from last year, I inserted so much military stuff. There was a lot of Islamic stuff as well, but it was not just Islamic history or per se. We made a lot of stuff from the West, and that's normal because that's most of my content. But again, these things are also important because they inform dramatically the same West in many ways as a reaction, and also as simply partly a shared culture. All these translations from Greek and Arab that were carried out later on informed dramatically the same. The way the Muslims had read Aristotle, as you know, was essentially the one that was studied in the university theology faculty in Paris. So, in any case, for today we stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.